This hearing will come to order. As this hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If we have noticed that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remain, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remain, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order to be recognized in order of seniority, and finally members not present at the time the hearing is called. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Before I give my remarks, I'd like to welcome our ranking member, Mr. Womack, for his very first hearing with our subcommittee. We have gained a few new members to our subcommittee this Congress, Mr. Pocan and Ms. Lawrence. I'd like to welcome them as well, and our returning subcommittee members. I'll keep my opening statement brief so we can get right into the questions. This morning, we welcome Benjamin Havlin, Chairman of the Election Assistance Commission, to testify on EAC's work to ensure our federal elections are fair, secure, and accessible. Chairman Havlin, thank you for being here today. It is well known that our foreign adversaries have made attempts and even breached our U.S. election system to varying degrees in 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections. U.S. officials at all levels of government have worked tirelessly to address vulnerabilities in our election systems. As a result, the 2020 election was declared, quote, the most secure in American history by the previous administration's own Department of Homeland Security. The fact those dedicated election officials were able to achieve this feat amid a global pandemic is even more remarkable. However, now is not the time to proclaim mission accomplished. Even though the 2020 election was secure, we know there was malicious activity from foreign adversaries leading up to Election Day. The threats to our democracy are constant and ever evolving. Our enemies will not be taking a break, so neither can we. This subcommittee has helped lead Congress efforts to address this issue. Since fiscal year 2018, we provide $805 million in grants to states to improve election security. We provided an additional $400 million last year to help states prepare for the 2020 elections during the pandemic. As we know, EAC administrators this funding to the states. Mr. Havlin, I hope you can help us better understand what the states still need and how they are currently spending the money. We have made significant and important investments in these grants. It seems the sporadic nature of these funds has hampered the ability of states to spend the money more quickly. I am curious to know your thoughts on how consistent year after year funding could help improve the rate at which states spend, and other ideas you might have to incentivize states to get money out the door faster. We'd also want to hear about EAC's work to help election officials improve the administration of elections and help Americans participate in the voting process. We must ensure the agency has sufficient funds to do so. After their funding was slashed nearly in half between 2010 and 2019, EAC received a significant infusion of funds in fiscal year 20. Fiscal year 21 sustained that upward trend, providing the agency with $17 million. As the U.S. continues to face threats to our elections, now more than ever, we must ensure that EAC has the necessary resources to provide vital support to states and the voting public. I look forward to hearing from Commissioner Havlin this morning on the election security grants and what additional tools, resources, and need for safety, security, and accessibility of our elections. Before I return to our witness for his statement, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Womack, for his opening remarks. Do I need to unmute? Do we need to unmute you, sir? Are they telling you anything? What are they saying? Anything?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay, good. I apologize. It may have been my ear pods that were denying my audio from going through. Hey, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and it's great to be with everybody this morning. I noticed that Chairwoman DeLauro talked about freezing rain in Connecticut this morning. I think Northwest Arkansas is winning the prize today. If I heard correctly to our news this morning, the previous overnight low in Northwest Arkansas was about 4 degrees. That was the previous record. This morning, right before 6 o'clock, when I went to my breakfast table for my morning coffee, our temperature this morning in Rogers, Arkansas was minus 15 below zero.
That's Chicago cold.
That's pretty Chicago. That's correct, which explains a lot about Chicago. But nonetheless, we got 4 to 6 inches of snow over the last couple of days. We're going to get hit again tonight with another 3 or 4 inches of snow before we get into a warming trend by weekend. But it's great to be with you. And Chairman, thank you for your kind words. And I want to say hello, a big shout out to our witness this morning, who happens to hail from my district. He is a Eureka Springs, Arkansas native, and went to college at the University of Central Arkansas, and we're delighted to have him here today. It's a great honor to be the ranking member on financial services and general government. This subcommittee is charged with funding programs that impact nearly every American in our nation, with a range of jurisdiction over sanctions enforcement, tax administration, the White House, federal courts, and a lot more. I look forward to working with my friend Chairman Quigley and all of the members of the subcommittee. At the end of last year, despite our political differences, the committee was able to fulfill our Article 1 duty, completing 12 approach bills along with the needed COVID relief, which was enacted into law on a bipartisan and bicameral basis. That spirit of unity and consensus should be continued as we work to advance appropriations bills in the coming months. As we turn to today's hearing, I know each of us recognizes the importance of ensuring the security and integrity of our nation's elections. It's fundamental to our democracy. In Arkansas, we're blessed to have an effective and reliable system when we go to the polls. The Election Assistance Commission has an important job assisting state and local election officials by administering grants to states, developing best practices, and acting as a clearinghouse of election administration information. We're grateful for that. The coronavirus pandemic challenged state and local election officials across the country as they worked to modify their election processes to ensure voters could exercise their rights in a safe environment. As they navigated these new circumstances, they also maintained focus on potential cybersecurity vulnerabilities to voter registration systems, voting machines, and systems that tabulate and display election results. I'm pleased the Commission has worked closely with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, as well as Cyber Command, to make sure state and local officials better understand the threats they face and how to mitigate them. I hope these partnerships between the federal government and state and local election officials continue to grow. However, I don't want to see the heavy hand of Washington bureaucrats dictate to state and local officials how their elections must be administered or what equipment to use. Keeping the administration of elections in control of the states is part of the bedrock system that has served America since its founding. I also believe states should be responsible for funding the costs of voting machines and election execution. Not only does it incentivize effective management and decision making, but with our national debt in excess of 28 trillion and growing, it also recognizes the harsh fiscal trajectory faced by unbridled spending. We need to be targeted and direct federal tax dollars to the areas of the greatest need. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witness, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. And before we go to our witness, we are honored to be joined by the chairwoman of the full Appropriations Committee, Chairwoman DeLauro. There she is.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Wonderful to be with you, and I thank you. And I'm obviously honored to be chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, and I'm going to try to make as many of the committee hearings as I possibly can. But it's a pleasure to join with all of you today, and I want to recognize Chairman Mike Quigley, Ranking Member Steve Womack for organizing the hearing, and I thank the Election Assistance Commissioner, Mr. Hovland, who will testify this morning. I think the subject of today's hearing is so critical, and that we need to look at the steps that we have taken to secure our democratic systems. And I know that's what we are going to hear about this morning. Almost 400 years ago, our democracy was founded on the premise that all people are created equal. The right to vote would grow with each generation to ensure that democracy. And today, in some respects, we have seen that challenged. For 4 years now, our right to vote has been threatened by foreign adversaries, and this year by challenges that we had at the state level. And this hearing is an opportunity to provide an opportunity to discuss the EAC's resurgence after years of the agency being underfunded in previous Congresses. I look forward to hearing more about EAC's plans to continue to expand their ability to support state efforts to enhance election security, increase access to the polls, and other activities to improve the administration of federal elections. It was not that long ago that we had these conversations. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 made broad reforms to the administration of federal elections, and the act established the EAC to quell many of these vulnerabilities. As the chairman pointed out a moment ago, to our detriment, between 2010 and 2019, the EAC's annual funding was cut by nearly 50%. This inconsistent, insufficient federal funding has hindered the ability of EAC and state and local election officials to combat very real threats to election security. The rise of misinformation and the coronavirus pandemic have only further complicated these efforts. I want to say a thank you to Chairman Quigley for the first significant allocation of funds to enable the EAC to begin to increase staffing and to expand the agency's support to election officials in 2020. Again, in fiscal year 2021, the chairman, ranking member, further increased the EAC's funding to $17 million. The increases have enabled the EAC to begin to rebuild the staffing, which has already doubled in the past year, and expanded the agency's support to state election officials. And that is just a start. There's still a considerable room for improvement, as many states lack the funds to implement necessary election security measures. But no voter should ever have to choose between their health and their right to vote. One of our core responsibilities on this committee is to ensure that the agencies under our purview safeguard America's election processes and our democracy. And the EAC is a national clearinghouse for information on election administration and accessibility, and the only federal agency completely dedicated to election administration. So now more than ever, we need to provide the necessary resources, support that protection of our democracy, secure our elections. I want to say again, thank you for your work, and I look forward to hearing the testimony on this very important subject. And I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We appreciate your being here. We look forward to your leadership. Now I'd like to bring on our featured guest today, the Chairman of the Election Assistance Commission, Benjamin Havlin. Sir, thank you for being here. Please go forward with your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Quigley, Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Ben Hovland, Chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or EAC. I appreciate the subcommittee's invitation to testify on the work of the EAC and the impact of the election security and pandemic response grants provided by Congress to the states. The story of election administration in 2020 should not be told without acknowledging the tremendous job that state and local election officials did to run their elections while facing unprecedented challenges. With a record of nearly 160 million Americans voting in the November general election in the middle of a global pandemic, the effort required to conduct this election was Herculean, and the officials who managed this task deserve our thanks and praise. While politics in the aftermath of the November election have distracted many from how the election was run, I can unequivocally say this was the best administered election I've seen in my career. There are many reasons for this success story, but first and foremost is that the public servants that run elections in cities and counties across the country put their personal health on the line and worked countless hours for their voters and our democracy. Federal grant money also played an essential role in assisting election officials with some of the challenges they faced. Since 2018, Congress has appropriated $805 million for election security. This has helped replace outdated and paperless voting machines, replace or harden statewide voter registration databases, create innovative new programs like Cyber Navigators that address head-on some of the resource disparity challenges of our decentralized election system, and provided for countless hours of training for staff to be on alert and prepare and respond to common attack vectors. The critical impact of this funding, combined with the impressive efforts of state, local, and federal partners, gave me complete confidence when joining the statement from the Elections Infrastructure, Government, and Sector Coordinating Executive Committees that the November 3rd election was the most secure in our nation's history. Additionally, the $400 million provided as part of the CARES Act in April of 2020 helped election officials address some of the additional costs associated with running both the largest mail and absentee ballot election most jurisdictions had ever experienced and making polling places as safe as possible for voters and election workers. The EAC was proud of the work we did to distribute and administer these grants to the states and appreciate this committee's trust in us to do the job. The recent funding increase to the EAC from Congress also increased our capacity to assist election officials during this challenging time. From an all-time low operating budget of $7.95 million in FY19, the increase in FY20 made for an exciting time at the EAC. We expanded the EAC workforce by hiring experts in important areas of our work, including numerous mission-critical positions across departments. Throughout the 2020 primaries and general election, the EAC provided much-needed assistance to election officials. By chairing the Elections Infrastructure Joint COVID-19 Working Group, we were able to leverage partnerships with state, local, and federal partners to quickly respond with guidance on the challenges presented by the pandemic. We also developed new guidance, hosted public forums on pandemic-related concerns, and closely monitored innovative state preparations, encouraging election officials to share their successes and challenges. These efforts included dozens of educational videos, materials for election officials highlighting proven best practices, addressing specific concerns related to COVID-19 and the use of CARES Act funding. Other new efforts included creating the EAC's new Cyber Access and Security Program, which provided security training, best practices, and other assistance for election officials tasked with protecting critical election infrastructure. The EAC also established the first ever National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, galvanizing national recruitment efforts and alleviating concerns about a significant shortage in poll workers due to the pandemic. While we acknowledge the success of the state and local election officials to administer the 2020 election, it's also clear that there's much work to be done. If the 2020 election has taught us anything, it's that our democracy is precious, we must invest in it to make it stronger, and we must constantly seek to improve it. As the election infrastructure sector-specific plan notes, a government-wide approach to funding elections and election security is needed. Viewing the subsector as an infrastructure of our democracy is important to understand the need for consistent investment and maintenance to ensure the system is strong. We appreciate your interest in the EAC's ongoing efforts. With its limited resources, the EAC has helped assist state and local officials through this unprecedented time. But the job ahead requires the proper level of investment to ensure lasting success. The EAC is prepared to play an increased role in this pursuit, and we look forward to our continued partnership with the subcommittee and with Congress. Thank you, Mr. Members of the subcommittee. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. We're starting to have these hearings in rapid succession, so some members have conflicts. I'm going to let Mr. Bishop go first just because he has one and then another, one occurring now and then shortly thereafter. So I recognize Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Hovland, for your testimony and all of the work that the EAC has done over the past year and few months. Let me get right into the questions, and I will try to be very brief if I can. I want to talk about the mail-in voting. The ongoing coronavirus pandemic has been many challenges in administering the 2020 elections, and to minimize exposure, about 100 million Americans voted early. You mentioned that the CARES Act provided $400 million in emergency funding. Can you tell us how this funding was used by states to improve their mail-in and absentee voting procedures? And the flexibility was crucial in keeping Americans safe, but many opted to vote in person. So tell us how the EAC supported in-person voting in the 2020 election. And finally, another subject that's very, very near and dear to me. I had a conversation and a meeting just yesterday with the National Federation for the Blind. And they raised serious concerns about accessibility for voters with disabilities. And they particularly were concerned with legislation that could ensure that Americans with disabilities have the same opportunity to vote freely and independently as other voters. And they indicated that with the absentee and the mail-in vote, that sometimes it is very, very difficult for them to access that. Of course, obviously, it's not in Braille. And they would like for the EAC and for Congress to look at some way to assure that they can be communicated with actively and accurately and effectively, and that they can respond because they find the current processes for absentee mail-in ballots to be somewhat onerous for them. Thank you very much. If you can handle that, I will yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Bishop. As mentioned, the CARES Act was a big deal for states and localities to get this money during the pandemic. As I mentioned in my testimony, most jurisdictions were facing the largest mail-in absentee ballot election they'd ever had. Now, that doesn't mean people aren't used to having mail-in absentee ballots. We know from the Election Administration and Voting Survey that about 25% of Americans voted that way in 2016. This year, it'll be closer to 50%. But some of the things that the importance of getting that money out and getting it early like it was allowed people to make equipment upgrades. Possibly some things that were done manually were able to be done automated to handle that volume increase. We worked, I mentioned the COVID-19 Joint Working Group that worked with election officials and the private sector in election space to identify best practices. We had one of the benefits of decentralized elections was you had election officials from Washington and Oregon and Utah and Colorado who had been implementing vote by mail and expanded absentee balloting for decades, and were able to share some of those lessons learned with their colleagues that didn't have that luxury of time to ramp that up. And so that made a humongous difference in those preparations. At the EAC, we did videos with those officials to share with people, again, produced various guides, but a lot of it also was getting that money early to take into account some of those procurement timelines. You also mentioned the in-person, making that as safe as possible. Again, the joint working group addressed a lot of those issues. We also worked with the CDC to issue guidance on how you make polling places as safe as possible for voters and poll workers. And you saw a lot of innovation, from one-time use pens to reduce regular contact surfaces. We saw the I voted pen make an appearance this year in some places instead of the I voted sticker. And I just want to make sure I leave time to address your question about accessibility. Absolutely agree with that. You know, the Help America Vote Act that created the Election Assistance Commission was in many ways a piece of accessibility legislation, making sure that Americans could vote independently and privately. We work to share best practices around that. I think there's more that we can do to make, for example, mail-in absentee ballot accessible to more Americans. Different states have implemented this different ways. You also have something that I think we can go farther than. It's probably a resource issue, but the MOVE Act required that each state have a portal for blank ballot delivery for military and overseas voters. You know, I think we can do a lot to possibly either build a template or encourage those to become both, you know, make sure those are secure and accessible so they can be used for military and overseas voters, but also as a great way to deliver blank ballots for accessibility purposes as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize Ranking Member Mr. Womack.
Once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witness. Just a couple of questions related to federal spending on elections. The CARES Act had if my numbers are correct, CARES Act had $400 million allocated to states for the 2020 election cycle related to COVID. The Speaker's HEROES Act, which wasn't enacted but did pass in the House twice on partisan votes, would have provided an additional $3.6 billion for this purpose. Based on initial data reported by the states, it's my understanding that states only used about $270 million, or about 68% of the $400 million provided in the CARES package. So it begs this question, Mr. Chairman: was the $400 million provided in CARES was it more than what the states actually needed, if in fact only about 68% of what was provided was actually used?
Thank you, Ranking Member Womack. You're right on those numbers. I would say the $270 million that we have, those are preliminary based on the 20-day reports that the CARES Act language required. The FFRs on that are due on February 28th, so that'll give us a more complete picture. I think when you look at that number, again, the low bar on that is going to be about 7% of that money being used, which was important. There were some issues, as you know. There was a 20% match requirement. That also triggered a lot of state legislative approval to use the money. So in some states that led to delays or challenges. When this money went out the door, it was toward the end of some state legislative cycles, or some had already ended. So there were some issues with that as far as getting funding out the door. What the number was exactly, again, this was probably the most expensive election that we've ever seen. You did see some private philanthropy come in that I don't recollect ever seeing. Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan spent about $400 million. And again, I've talked to the people who distributed that at the Center for Tech and Civic Life and election officials who received it. And that was going for the basics. That was going for PPE. That was going to disinfect and clean and to procure significantly or enough polling locations, places that had closed down because maybe they were senior centers and weren't available. Also locations that had enough room to social distance, both for voters and staff. And so it really is, getting the right number is a little bit tricky. I'm happy to dive down into some of the consistent issues that the chairman mentioned, but I think that's really what you look at as far as the CARES Act money went this year.
So if we go back to the HEROES package that I referenced just a minute ago, based on just some basic Arkansas math here, it was an amount 9 times greater than the 400 million in the CARES package. So let's just, for the sake of the argument, assume that the HEROES Act was enacted into law. What in the heck would we have been spending $3.6 billion on?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a proud graduate of Eureka Springs, Arkansas High School, so I'm good at Arkansas math. And I will say that, go Highlanders. Again, I think that anytime you look at federal election funding, the details matter, the expiration dates matter, the structure matters. When you look at, and we can talk about this more with some of the security grants, but the way that most of these grants are structured is that they go to the state. Well, state and localities have very different expenses and very different needs in the election space. The bulk of expenses with election administration in most states is borne out at the local level. And so that's important. I think one of the things that I've seen in some of the House appropriations bills has been a piece that mentions 50% in cash or in kind going to the locals. I think that's very important. Unfortunately, it hasn't made it through the Senate side yet, but that really recognizes the costs that are primarily borne out at the local level, but also allows for that flexibility because we do have top-down and bottom-up states in the way that they structure election administration around the country.
Yeah, one of my concerns as an appropriator, and this has been the case for the 10 plus years that I've served in Congress, is that invariably states and even further down on the local level, state, county levels, they all want more of our money. They all want more federal taxpayer money to execute missions that I think are incumbent on them to finance. Elections is part of it. Now, I'm not going to discount the fact that we shouldn't have a role in helping people through technical assistance and what have you on elections. But it just goes without saying that the more we give in this particular case, because of a COVID situation, it was maybe more of a one-off than normal. The more we give, the more they become reliant on those kinds of funding packages, which lessens the need in their respective opinions to be able to cough up the money locally. And I've always believed, and I'm a former mayor, that if it's our money that's in play, we're going to be very effective in how we administer that money. That if it's our money, we're going to make sure that it's spent for all the right reasons. If the money is gifted to us by another agency, sometimes it can be used a little more loosely. So I just want us to understand, I want all my colleagues on this committee to understand that we've got this significant debt hanging over future generations' head, and we've got to be careful not to allow more and more of the federal tax dollars to go for what is normally paid for at the more local level. And I got a lot more to say about that. I'll reserve that for another time, and I appreciate the opportunity to engage in the conversation today. Thank you, and I'm going to yield back.
Thank you. Recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. DeLauro. If she has any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I don't. I'm just interested in listening to the questions of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and thank you for this important hearing. So, as I said, I will try to continue to be present at these hearings, but I don't want to detract from what our colleagues on the subcommittee want to get at the core of this issue. So, thank you very, very much, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chairman, let me go ahead and ask a few questions here. We talked about the money not being used, and certainly the timing of that. you referenced certain issues. One of them was that there's a matching issue. It comes at the end. Some general assemblies don't meet very often, have opportunities. But you also glean, or do you hear from them that some of the other issues why this isn't happening? Is it because they went so long without that? Is it to an extent they're almost hoarding this so that they can level off the spending over a period of time, recognizing that, you know, next year they may get zero from the federal government, or other reasons?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, and I'll distinguish there a little bit between the CARES Act funding and the HAVA security grant money, because I think there are a little bit of differences. But on the security grants, in particular, that's exactly right. You know, for a long time, we went without any HAVA, additional HAVA money until 2018. So certainly, you know, there is that. You know, I know a lot of states wonder, you know, is this the end of federal money? You know, do I need to hold on to some of this? But I think a bigger part of it is, frankly, some of the timelines that we're on. So again, you've seen a lot of the FY18 money be spent, but you also have, you know, the FY20 money came at the end of 2019. We were a few weeks from the Iowa caucuses and getting right into the presidential cycle. For major procurements, it's difficult to do in an election year, but you also don't want to be making major equipment changes in the middle of a presidential election because of unintended consequences or possibly bugs with those systems. And so you see that there are states, you know, I'll give you two examples. Delaware replaced its paperless equipment using the FY18 money. Delaware got $3 million, the minimum in FY18, and they used all of that to assist with a $13 million purchase of equipment. And Delaware has 3 counties. You look at Louisiana, they're in the process of procuring a new statewide system. You know, the projections look at that as being about a $95 to $100 million purchase to cover their 64 parishes. And their federal portion from all of the security money, both the 18 and 20, adds up to about $12.5 million. So again, a significant portion, but they're still looking, you know, to get a significant state and local investment. And as soon as that procurement goes through, as soon as that contract goes through, you know, they'll have spent down to zero. And so you have sort of these buckets. Arkansas sub-grants to a lot of their counties, and that was spent on new equipment. Arkansas used all of its money. A different category, Illinois, new innovative program called Cyber Navigators, where you recognize that some counties just don't have the need or resources to have a dedicated cyber professional. So you have state employees that have regional responsibilities. You know, they have a handful of counties that they're responsible for. But that is a program that's designed to last over time and respond to the consistent nature of cybersecurity challenges. And so the spend down rate on that is slow. And then you have the category that I mentioned earlier that Louisiana's in, where they're just on the verge of a major procurement. Another example of that, I heard from a state election director recently. They expect to use up all of their money, their remaining money, replacing their statewide voter registration database. But again, that wasn't something they wanted to do in the middle of a presidential election cycle.
And just for the record, let me ask, do you get an exact run out of how each state spends its money?
Yes, we get that reported to us. Again, we get it on the fiscal year. So we get, you know, we have reporting through September 30th of 2020, and then they have till the end of the year to provide that for us. We're still working with a couple states to make sure that their numbers are right and that we've got that accurately, and then we'll provide a report. But again, when you look at the whole picture, you can see that the money is significant. You know, it isn't enough to cover some of the major purchases like total equipment replacement or voting machine replacement. And so what a lot of jurisdictions are doing, you know, the menu of options, and they're going through and prioritizing. You know, maybe that's replacing paperless equipment. Maybe it's implementing audits. cybersecurity training for staff, implementing programs like I mentioned with Illinois, the Cyber Navigators program. But again, a lot of that is making choices and priorities about each state's individual risks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Amade is recognized.
Hey, while we're playing with the camera, there it is. I'm just enjoying the education, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm looking forward to being on this committee in the 117th, so appreciate it. Chairman Hovland, thank you very much for being here. I just have a question around the last election, but really moving forward from it on voter misinformation. There was a Quinnipiac poll last month that found 37% of voters think that there was widespread fraud in the 2020 elections. And of course, we saw what happened, what that manifested to January 6th in some ways. So I have a three-part question regarding, one, what's the role of the commission in combating misinformation about elections? Two, are there some proactive steps that we're taking between now and the 2022 midterms to give Americans confidence in our election systems? And three, do you need any resources to help towards that end for 2022 and 2024?
Thank you for that. Absolutely. A great question, very important. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of benefits that we get to our decentralized election system this year. The assistance from the vote by mail states on how to ramp up was important. But one of the real challenges that we have to recognize is the decentralized system makes us more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. It's just harder to combat that because each state runs elections a little bit differently. And so I think, when we look at what we need to do on that, there were efforts this year that I think were important. The National Association of Secretaries of State drove a Trusted Info 2020, trying to get people to get their election information from state and local election officials. That was important, but I think we can do a lot more. We got a lot of calls, a lot of fact checking at the EAC. Our election administration and voting survey, has a lot of real facts about how elections are actually run. I think with the resources, and with adequate resources, I would love to see us establish a one-stop shop website that helps with voter education, helps with fact checking, has that information directly from the states about the various ways that, what is your registration deadline? When do you have to request a mail or absentee ballot? Those rules of the road for voting in one place, but also that could help direct people to their state or local election official. I think that our effort to create National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, where we had the helpamericavote.gov website, showed that you could have national campaigns that pointed people to one central location like helpamericavote.gov, but then that website gave people basic information and then got them to their state and local election official. And I think that's a model for how we can do that with broader election information and help educate the public around the processes and parts of voting, and again, get them the accurate information to their state, to their jurisdiction, but that will take more resources.
Great, thank you. And just a question as far as, in your opinion, are we capable of anticipating threats, and are our states capable of doing that, or do we need to provide any infrastructure help for any states right now that aren't up to speed?
I think we've done a great job on information sharing. Again, part of why I was comfortable making that statement about the security of the 2020 election is we've really seen this sea change in information sharing with the state, local, and federal level. Things like critical infrastructure designation have helped with that. There's been the creation of an election infrastructure information sharing and analysis center that's got almost 3,000 members in it. You really have a level of visibility and communication in the election space that we've never had before. That said, Chairman Quigley hit on it earlier, and it was sort of mentioned about an annual funding stream. I think that is one piece of this. The nature of cybersecurity threats, the ongoing nature of those threats, and the fact that it is a national security issue means there's real value to having a piece of federal funding that is known, that is dependable, that can be planned around so it's efficient. And also that says, there's a federal portion of the ballot. This is a national security issue. Here's the federal piece. State and locals, you're primarily responsible for running elections. You're primarily responsible for funding elections. You need to come up with the rest. And I think that's what the sector-specific plan really envisions in its funding section, where it talks about that whole of government approach to funding our elections.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Now yield to Ms. Lawrence.
I'm sorry, to who?
Ms. Lawrence?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I want to first of all take this time to thank our electors across the country. I have a question for you, Mr. Halva. Back in October, two right-wing individuals were charged in connection to racist robocalls aimed to dissuade and discourage around 12,000 Black residents in Detroit and other U.S. cities from voting in the November election, telling them that voting by mail in the upcoming election was subject to their arrests, debt collection, and a forced vaccine. What do we need to do to fight misinformation campaigns from our citizens, particularly in the underserved or the communities in the Black and Brown communities? What public engagement campaigns is the EAC employing to combat this disinformation? And we know that election security and what we struggled with the most in this last election was misinformation. I would like a response to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lawrence. Great question. That is absolutely, I think, one of the biggest challenges. I think there were a lot of things that you hit on there that are important to dive down into. One, we see more and more misinformation and disinformation. Both that's domestic, but also amplified by foreign adversaries that often mirrors traditional voter suppression tactics. That's a real concern. Obviously, if it's domestic, that should be enforced by the DOJ or local prosecutors. But to your main point, I think we can do more around the voter education space. I mentioned the one-stop shop website. I think that's a big deal. Getting that trusted source information to voters, having one place that you can point people to. Another thing I didn't mention earlier, we're in an interagency agreement with GSA on vote.gov. That's around voter registration, but I think that's something that can be expanded on. I think you can have basic voter education videos there to help reduce barriers to entry, or we know from various various studies that a lot of people aren't comfortable participating because they're not familiar with the process. They don't want to go into the polling place and not understand what's happening, or maybe they don't know how mail-in absentee balloting works. And even at the national level, I think we can do basic voter education videos to reduce that, reduce people's potential for being intimidated with things like you described. Again, I think there's a lot of work we can do there to address voter education. And on a lot of these things, when you think about the fiscal impact, I recognize what the ranking member said, but when we can find those areas at the EAC where you have a 50-state impact or close to it, a dollar invested at the federal government can save taxpayers dollars around the country, because you're not reinventing the wheel. You get that economies of scale of a national approach and the ability to utilize other organizations to amplify those messages at the national scale and have, again, like a lot of success with National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, getting amplified on a number of different places by, by celebrities, by various groups. And you really saw a new generation of poll workers step up. And so in many ways, I think that's a model we
Mr.
can use on voter education.
If I may, I am looking for a commitment for a public engagement campaign for misinformation. So you hit upon a couple of those things, partnering with the Secretary of State so that there could be automatic campaigns that address misinformation. The website is good, but these are robocalls going into homes. So just to be committed financially to your budget and a commitment that you can make, because that misinformation, if we don't attack that and change that, we're never going to get our election process to be sustainable. And we fought through it this time, and I'm so proud of all the engagement. And so you name some of the private entities that you're working with. And I just want to be on the record that the targeted groups are usually those who are minority groups and underserved, and there is a benefit to not having a turnout. So thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And I apologize if I went out of order. I didn't realize Mr. Stewart had joined us. He is now recognized.
Yeah, thanks. I've actually been on the whole time, and sometimes, Mr. Quigley, some of us may not have our cameras on the whole time, so that may make it a little bit hard.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, hey, no worries at all. Two things, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being with us, and again, Mr. Quigley and Ranking Member, thanks for hosting. Let me ask my two questions and then allow you to respond. They're a little bit different. One is many of us are familiar with solar winds. It is a catastrophe, actually, in the cyber world. I need to understand, did we have any evidence that any of our processes in elections were violated or compromised at all by solar winds, especially knowing that it's been out there for a long time? Second question is, you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Zuckerberg's, he said 400 million. It was actually about $420 million he contributed to nonprofit organizations, private organizations, Safe Elections projects being one of them, but there were others as well. My concern is, and my question to you is, do you know how that money was spent? And was it spent evenly? For example, if we have private individuals or companies that are coming in and spending hundreds of millions of dollars, in some places maybe more than the federal government is spending, but say they target blue-leaning districts or blue-leaning states, or perhaps another group comes in and targets red districts or red states. I think that would be problematic. That would be very obvious to both of us. Talk to us about that, the funding of these private groups, our ability to know how that money is being spent, and is that actually influencing the outcome, or could it potentially influence the outcome if it is spent in one district or another?
Thank you for the question. First, on the solar winds, I haven't seen any evidence that the election or any tallies were impacted. Again, some of the things that were in place this year that were crucially important to that confidence was you had about 95% of Americans vote on a paper ballot or a paper audit trail. Obviously, in a number of the close states, we saw exhaustive audits and recounts, hand inspection in Georgia that reconfirmed the machine tallies, and all of that was very important to having confidence in the elections. I think that solar winds is just such a reminder of the evolving nature of these challenges, and basically that we can't, I think that election officials did an amazing job this year. Again, there's been a sea change in information sharing at the federal level, but really it's just a great reminder that the work has to continue, the investment has to continue. That's the nature of these threats and challenges. As far as the private philanthropy money to cover some of the COVID expenses, I have had briefings on that. It was available to jurisdictions all over the country. It went to, counties run by Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It was available to every.
Do you know how that money was spent, though? Can you say that X amount was spent in these states and X amount spent in another?
I don't have those breakdowns because that wasn't money we distributed. I think that it's important that money came in given the pandemic, but on a balance, I view it as a failure of government that states and jurisdictions had to rely on the philanthropy of billionaires to be able to buy some of the basics, some of the PPE expenses they had, some of the disinfecting equipment expenses they had, some of the space to adequately socially distance their staff as they put their own personal health on the line to run our elections. And so, again, I think that I'm glad it was there for the jurisdictions that needed it this year, but I hope we can remedy that in the future so that we don't have to rely on private philanthropy in this space.
Well, I agree, and I think we should. And by the way, I'm asking you if you would try to find that information for us. Could you do that?
I'm absolutely happy to have conversations and look into that and reach out for more information.
Yeah, find out. And if we can't find out that information, that's a problem. And we should be able to know that. If someone is contributing in ways that are election oriented, we should know how that money is spent and where that money is spent. And the second thing is, this is, to your point, Chairman, this is primarily to preclude or to help with some of the expenses of COVID and precluding a bad outcome there. But I worry that it sets a precedent that will be that will continue into the future. In 4 years, hopefully, God willing, we're not dealing with COVID. And now, though, do we think that we've set a precedent where you have private individuals who come in with hundreds of millions of dollars and again are targeting specific districts or states, and look, that would be a real problem. It'd be a real problem for either side, and I think we need to know if that's a problem or if it potentially could be. The first way to deal with that is to know where that money was spent. So again, we really appreciate if you get back with us on that.
Thank you. Torres is recognized.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, did you say Torres?
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to welcome Elections Assistance Commissioner, Commission Chairman Hovland to our committee. Thank you for being here with us today. I must stress that there is a great need for you to work together with other federal agencies, other federal secretaries, to ensure that everyone is working toward the same goal when it comes to election security, when it comes to delivery of ballots. So with that in mind, I have three issues that I would like to address with you. And that's the Postal Service. The Postal Service was severely handicapped, reduced, attacked, whatever word you may wish to use to describe what happened in those last 2 months before Election Day. It caused a lot of delays of mail-in ballots due to the pandemic. So state deadlines did not align with the reality of the mail system that was set up. It was really a setup for voters to fail to deliver their ballots on time. So what role has the EAC played? And moving forward, what role can the EAC play to ensure that state voting deadlines, number one, align with the reality of the USPS? And what additional steps can Congress take to ensure the USPS guarantees on-time delivery of all domestic mail-in ballots sent before the Saturday before Election Day? On that same note, given the issues surrounding postal delays in this last election, it is imperative that voters have alternative ways of returning their mail-in ballots, such as drop boxes. However, we must ensure that drop-off boxes are placed in locations that are secure, and that we establish minimum guidelines. In my home state of California, for example, the GOP placed more than 50 drop-off ballot boxes in Los Angeles, Fresno, and Orange counties, which were fraudulently labeled as official ballot boxes. The other issue was already mentioned by a previous colleague as it relates to people with disabilities. There are 7 million eligible voters who live with visual impairments. All of these voters have a legal right to vote under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Help America Vote. So what are you looking to do to help ensure that ballots someday are available in Braille to ensure that we have a voting system that is truly a personal vote and doesn't have to be disclosed simply because someone needs assistance from either their caregiver to fill out their ballot.
Thank you for those questions, Representative. On the USPS issue, we work fairly closely with the USPS. The specific issue you mentioned on the state deadlines, that isn't new. There was obviously a little more focus on it this year. That's certainly something that state lawmakers balance how, on one hand, you want to make absentee ballots available to people who may not have another option. But again, if you allow, for example, some states allow for a request 3 days before the election. Well, it's not realistic that that's going to make it both ways in transit. You obviously then also have different states that have either a postmark or postal indicator deadline or a received by election day deadline. And so those make a difference. Again, I think we'll continue to work on best practices. I think maybe
I'm going to interrupt you there because we cannot abandon our responsibility to ensure that a federal election happens and that voters are not disenfranchised. So that is your task. So I hope that you will come back to our committee and provide some input on what we can do to ensure there are minimum requirements for states to meet these guidelines.
Well, and I'll give you a quick thing that I think would make a huge difference. A few years ago, the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, did a pilot program with the USPS on full end-to-end tracking for UOCAVA ballots, uniformed and overseas citizens. And my understanding is that you could go full UOCAVA and in turn, basically full domestic tracking for about $8 million to the post office. Not only would that help election officials understand where ballots are, see problems that can be identified immediately if there's a pallet of ballots on a loading dock that's getting delayed, but it would also help voters have that confidence that they can see it, in transit both ways. And a lot of states have done that. We saw that as a big improvement this year. But I think if you have a uniform system of that implemented by the USPS, then people could build apps off that. People could do more off that baseline because it would be uniform across the country. I think that's an immediate improvement that could happen.
Thank you. Ms. Kirkpatrick is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Helen, for being here. As you know, in Arizona, over 90% of our vote is vote by mail, and so which is a good thing. I mean, that we've really seen an improvement in voter participation because of that. But we have many tribal areas and rural areas that don't have everyday mail service, and so my question is, what are you doing to address those really rural areas, especially tribal areas, where they don't have daily mail service?
Thank you for that. Again, a hugely important issue. You're right, Arizona's permanent early voting list has led to significant expansion into mail and absentee balloting there, and that helps a lot of people, but there are challenges with USPS delivery. Certainly that's something we're aware of. We continue to highlight best practices, but one of the things, and that is a hugely important issue, but I think one of the things that's important to recognize too is the nature of the EAC. We are a small agency. It was mentioned that we were at an all-time low in 2019 of an operating budget of $7.95 million. And this year, there was 17, but we passed through about 1.5 of that to NIST. So we have a $15.5 million operating budget. That means we're almost to where we were. We're a little below what we were with inflation a decade ago. And you look at a sister agency like the Federal Election Commission that does campaign finance, they're at $70 million. You look at the election program at CISA, that's $40 million as part of a $1.5 billion sub-agency. And so when you look at our 50-state jurisdiction and the breadth of the challenges to election administration in this country, being an election administrator has never been harder than it is right now. And elections are chronically under-resourced all across the country at the state and local level and also at the federal level. I wouldn't hesitate to say that we should be a $100 million agency to take on the challenges that people expect of us. And I know that doesn't happen overnight, but I think this is a great example of one of those issues that needs to be tackled. And just when we look at our statutory mandates, when we look at the things that we're required to do under the Help America Vote Act, this is important and we want to work on it and work on best practices. But there's also a reality to what we're able to do with the resources that Congress has given us.
My follow-up question has to do with violence at polling places. And so this was an emotional election. We had marches in Arizona. We had people, angry crowds, marching to the polls. And I just wonder if two things, are you seeing that having a chilling effect on volunteers who work the polls? And do you think it's actually having a chilling effect on the turnout?
I think what we saw more of this year, there were certainly, absolutely Arizona had, was a hot spot in many ways. I think we saw more of that in the aftermath. A number of election officials, receiving death threats, totally unacceptable. Again, these are public servants that put their personal health on the line in service of our democracy, people that care more about the integrity of our elections than anyone else. And so really, completely unacceptable, really unfortunate. I hope that it doesn't deter people from getting in this space. I do think it was an extremely stressful year and there is a level of burnout amongst election officials. But it's one more reason that we need to recognize the work they do, provide sufficient resources. Again, the job has never been harder. And that's both the administration pieces, but then the challenges that you're alluding to as far as around voter education to the process. More people saw more of the process this year than probably ever before. Most people tune in election night, see the preliminary results and tune out. But this year we saw the audits. We saw people going through provisional ballots to figure out if someone was eligible or not. We saw the canvass and certification process. And I think that was important, but clearly we can do more to educate people around that, and we can clearly do more to support our election officials around the country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Look, good question, Chairman. Is there anything you'd suggest that we would do to incentivize the states to move the money out quicker if need be?
So I think that a few things on the security grant money. I think that there's a lot that ties into the timeline I mentioned. I think if people knew there was a consistent annual funding stream coming, it would allow for them to plan for that accordingly. You could look at expiration dates. The 18 and 20 money doesn't have expirations, and again, I think because that was the first real money to come in a long time. I don't know that people have confidence that there will be more. But then you saw at the same time the expiration CARES Act money was maybe a little too short. And so I think we're happy. Our grants team does a great job working with all the states. We're happy to work with your staff and try to work on some of those details. Of course, it should involve talking to state and local election officials and recognizing part of the difference I mentioned before in costs that are borne out at the state level and those that are borne out at the local level. But I think there's a lot we can do and are happy to work on that with you.
Sure. Mr. Womack, do you have a follow-up question? I'm trying to do sort of a hybrid second round where we don't have as much time, but I do want folks, if they have something they wanted to finish up, that opportunity.
Yeah, I do, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. And Chairman Hovland, I do appreciate the information you're giving us today. This is a question about misuse of funding. How how are you organized, set up, and how, because this comes back to kind of our oversight piece, how are we able to discern the misuse of funds if and when it happens, and then what actions are then taken? What prompts, say, an IG report that would have the ability to recover the misuse of funds? So if you can talk generally about that particular subject.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And actually, when I mentioned our budget earlier, one piece that's important in there is that we spend about $1 million a year on our inspector general. For an agency our size, that is a huge portion of our budget. Again, even when our budget was down to $8 million, $1 million of that was going to our inspector general. And that is because our inspector general's office audits all of this HAVA money. They contract out for a lot of that, but to audit this money, usually it's about 5 or 6 states a year, sometimes a little bit more. This year, actually, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and West Virginia were all audited. And so we're looking back at that money, we're looking how it's spent, looking at the receipts, making sure that it falls into categories that are allowed by Congress, qualifying expenses, and then we provide those reports to you. We'll continue to do that, move across the country and make it through that. And in those efforts, we're looking at CARES money, we're looking at security money, we're looking at the old HAVA money for any jurors or states that still have that. And so a big part of our role is both helping states and jurisdictions on the front end, providing information, resources, webinars on allowed expenses or ways that people can use the money. But then, of course, on the back end, also auditing that to making sure that it's been used correctly.
My final question, Mr. Chairman, would be this, and that is, in education, we have accreditation standards and we have accreditation facilities set up with which to be able to monitor and judge just how effective our educational institutions are. Is there an accreditation standard, and is there an accreditation platform by which our states are judged as to how they carry out their mission on elections?
Again, with our decentralized elections, I wouldn't say there's certainly no federal standard. Obviously, we have a decentralized election system. The EAC is largely non-regulatory. In a small agency, you do see things that are created, things like the Election Performance Index that is now housed out of the MIT Election Lab. It was created by the Pew Charitable Trust. But that is a ranking of different categories. They use a lot of election administration and voting survey data in that. There's a number of different ways that you can look at it. I think a little different than a ranking standard, but to your question earlier on resourcing and how we get there, one of the great things about the Election Assistance Commission when Congress created it with the Help America Vote Act was the federal clearinghouse responsibility. There's so much more that we can do with that, but one of the big areas that I'd like to see us expand into more of is doing trainings, because that does, sharing those best practices that election officials discover across the country, but doing trainings around that to really help, everyone get better, and the efficiencies that we can realize through that, the tax dollars that we can save through that, I think are significant. And I think that's a critical mission for the agency in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Good. And then as we try to do a hyphenated second round, recognize Ms. Torres if she has a follow-up.
I do not, Mr. Chairman. I will put a letter together for the chairman. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Ms. Kirkpatrick?
I do have a follow-up. This is
Can you get a little closer, please, to your microphone?
Sure.
Sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah. My question is, what are your concerns about violence at the polling places? my question has to do with making sure that we've got adequate poll workers and turnout in every election. And again, you know, do you see threats of violence as having a chilling effect on that, on being able to recruit volunteers?
I think that one of the things, one of the real silver linings that I saw in this year's election, in the primaries, you saw a lot of dropout around poll workers. We know from the Election Administration and Voting Survey that the majority of poll workers are over age 60. And we know that recruiting poll workers is always challenging. In 2018, about 70% of jurisdictions had at least some difficulty finding enough poll workers. And so in the primaries, you saw, particularly some of the states that had primaries right in the early days of the pandemic, like Wisconsin, had huge dropout, had to shut down a lot of polling places, and so it became clear that it was going to be critical to have enough poll workers. That was part of why we launched the National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. There were also a lot of other efforts, Power of the Polls, Poll Heroes Project. You saw employers giving people the day off. And what it really resulted in this year was a new generation of Americans stepping up and serving as poll workers. And it's my hope. I've served as a poll worker a number of times. And it's my hope that their experience was similar to mine, that they realized that they were the customer service face of our democracy. And what they were there to do, didn't have anything to do with who people were voting for, but simply that they were there. And it was your opportunity to make their experience with the process be a good one. Help that 18-year-old who's a little bit nervous, or the senior citizen that's been voting longer than you've been alive. Give them a little extra assistance and give them the I voted sticker and thank them for coming out. I know that was the experience I had as a poll worker, and I'm hopeful that this new generation had that experience as well. And we'll see that make a difference in 2022 and 2024, because poll worker recruitment has been a challenge for a long time. And I think it's something we need to continue to amplify. I think we learned this year that a lot of people didn't know it was a way they could serve in their community. And so I think we're going to continue to push those efforts, but it is crucial.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Almeida, you didn't have a question the first time. Do you do the second round? Not sure if he's still with us. So we'll ask Mr. Stewart the same question if he's not there. I assume the silence is either they're no longer with us or it's a negative. So what we'll do is we'll wrap up. Chairman, I want to thank you for your service, for your work, and for your willingness to participate with us today. Mr. Ranking Member, do you have anything else you want to say in closing?
No, not at all. But again, good to have Chairman Hovland with us. Good Carroll County product from Arkansas and a UCA product, and it's good to have him here. And next time you're back in the 3rd District of Arkansas, make sure I get a call. Let me know.
All right, that sounds good.
I want to thank all who helped put this together, all those who participated. The staff was outstanding. These are difficult times. We look forward to seeing you all in person as we do this next time. And we'll see you all soon. We are adjourned. Thank you. Thanks, Chairman.